I think you are somebody of the same ilk as me. And when it comes to conversations like this, it's not a right or wrong conversation. Maybe from me, I don't want to put words in your mouth. It's more of an amicable discussion with two people that have information, that have opinions, that have intellect, are intelligent enough to have amicable discussions, especially in society that we have today.
Yeah.
And so, and as I said, as I do a terrible job of introducing because we can just jump into all of the things that we want to talk about, but I'm going to pause. I'm going to introduce you. Ben Hudson, the vegan farmer. You reached out to me, or I was tagged into one of your posts. Yeah. I commented, I DM'd, I said, man, I'd love to have a conversation with you because, again, you're very, very different than the typical people that I get tagged into.
Sure.
So I'll let you introduce yourself, Ben, and what do you do? Who are you? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So appreciate the opportunity here. And yeah, so growing up, I was a hunter. So I wasn't always a vegan. But yeah, growing up, I was hunting, doing a lot of fishing and trapping as well. I grew up in the timber industry, so we always had access to different, land to do hunting and outdoor recreation.
Did you grow up in South Carolina or North Carolina? One of the Carolinas, right?
South Carolina here, actually about 20, 30 minutes from where my farm is now. So very, very close to home here. But yeah, I grew up hunting, fishing, all of that. As I got older, I really got interested in like biodiversity and environmentalism. So I started studying more and more, also about like health, and got into like plant-based diets, and also started learning more about the impacts of hunting and other exploitative practices, that were having impacts on ecosystems around me, and kind of began to question a lot of what I was taught, in the hunting culture that I grew up in. So now I operate a veganic farm. So we practice veganic agriculture, and we also, so it's about 100-acre farm. So we have a lot of wildlife area. We're actually restoring former pasture or hay farm into like food forests. So doing a lot of rewilding projects. We also sell at a farmer's market local to us. And I also have co-founded a nonprofit animal sanctuary with my wife. So we stay very busy.
Yeah, you said we, and I noticed you have the wedding ring on. Is your wife a part of the farm? She works with the farm with you?
Yeah, absolutely. She's a huge part. She's actually out doing some seed starting right now and working in the garden. So yeah, it's a busy season right now. Coming into spring, so we're getting very busy with a lot of different farm work, getting ready for spring market. So yeah,
Is your 100-acre farm like one of those? Because we haven't found one here in Memphis, but I love it's one of those cooperatives that people can buy in and they get their like box of vegetables by the month.
So we've been wanting to look into that. Right now, we just do farmers market, like one a week. We might move to like 2 a week, but we're pretty small scale right now. We do like market gardening, so we're just kind of getting into more.
100 acres isn't small scale, dude. Well, jeez, that's a lot of work.
Yeah, absolutely. But we do a lot of stuff like fruit trees. So we do a lot of tree planting. Again, like about 50% of our property is devoted towards rewilding and wildlife habitat. So protecting. Unfortunately, when we first came out here and purchased the property, we had a lot of local folks who had gotten comfortable poaching on the property and trespassing. So a lot of, our first year or two was kind of talking to the neighbors and introducing ourselves and being like, hey, we really don't want hunting going down here. We're doing some different kind of work. So yeah, it's been an interesting road, kind of talking to other farmers in the area too, because a lot of what we do, whether it's conservation work, animal rescue, or farming, is pretty unconventional, I would say.
Sure. Are you getting any equip money to do any of your wildlife work on your property?
Yeah, so actually this was going to be the first year, but we actually haven't heard anything because of all the freezes that have happened. But yeah, we have supposedly we'll be able to get funding for some pollinator gardens, like in some of the pastures that we're restoring in the food forest. We're also going to be doing bluebird boxes as well as bat boxes. So yeah, a lot of work with the USDA in that regards.
Sweet. Yeah, they've got some great programs, CRP, obviously, WRP, WREP, some of their WIP programs. I was a professor in the wildlife fisheries department for almost 6 years at Mississippi State University, and it was just one of the big things that we incorporated into agricultural landscapes was, where are you, economically from a farming perspective, where are you losing money essentially? How can you break even or actually make money through these amazing USDA programs, benefit wildlife, create corridors, create connectivity, all those bits and pieces.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, that's a huge part of organic agriculture as well, a focus on the local ecosystems and improving biodiversity. Since, organic agriculture avoids the use of pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, as well as like tillage or other kind of conventional practices that are seen as destructive to soil health or local ecosystems. A lot of organic agriculture is focusing on, building native habitat for improving biodiversity to help with those issues that pesticides and herbicides would typically help with. Yeah, the USDA funding is definitely going to be huge for that. This is our first year being veganic certified. So we've gone through the North American Veganic Certification Program. We actually won a grant with them because of our work doing rewilding and stuff. So we got some money for some fruit trees and some native seeds and stuff like that. So yeah, lots of fun, in that department as well.
So this is full-time, right? You've taken this full-time. This is your full-time job?
Yeah, so I started my career in computer science and the software industry. I did almost 10 years of working for myself as well as working with different software companies, kind of moved from software engineering into management positions over time. But the more I spent, at a computer in the office, the more I realized I really want to get out into the field. I got really big into like growing my own food in my backyard when I was living in the city. So it was kind of just a natural progression. The wife's dream was to have an animal sanctuary and rescue. So we started looking at farm property to kind of, merge those two goals that we had. And yeah, here we are.
So in the beginning, you mentioned you were a hunter, grew up hunting.
Yeah.
Was there something that was like, man, that's it, I'm done. Like, I don't want to be a hunter anymore, that converted you over?
Yeah, I would say there were a few things. I mean, we did a lot of like bird hunting, dove, duck, that kind of stuff. So I was part of a lot of, I would say like well-meaning hunting. We did a lot of investment in, waterfowl habitat and stuff like that. But over time, I kind of saw that it was an exploitative practice. I didn't need to be consuming these animals that we were hunting. It was a lot more for recreation. I also had done like international hunting. So we actually flew to Argentina a few years before my kind of like ethical switch, I would say. And I did see some practices there in Argentina. Like I saw a dairy farm for the first time, which was pretty disturbing. But I also saw some practices in Argentina that was a little overexploitative of the wildlife, I would say. One experience was like we were duck hunting, and at the end we were helping the guides kind of pick ducks out of the pond that we were in. And my brother actually dragged in a few ducks that were completely rotten and just decomposing in the water. So that to me was kind of like, oh man, like, something's wrong here. Like we're killing more animals here than we can actually use. And that kind of rubbed me wrong. But I kept hunting. But then I had an experience where I really made a connection to kind of I'd say traumatic, but it wasn't super traumatic at the time. But an experience I had as a child rabbit hunting, where I was hunting by myself for the first time with a little BB gun, which of course I shouldn't have been hunting rabbits with a BB gun. But I was following this rabbit and trying to kill it. And I couldn't kill it with the BB gun. And I recognized that rabbit was suffering in the time, but being brought up in hunting, I was kind of like, oh, it's fine, it's just one rabbit. But later on, as I grew up and had other experiences in hunting, and recognized that it wasn't a necessary thing for me to be hunting, I actually met a domestic rabbit for the first time, who was like a pet, a companion animal, was actually my wife's rabbit of almost 10 years. And I recognized her personality. I recognized she had, preferences. She made friendships with cats. It was just like really wild to me to see this animal that I'd always seen as a resource, to see it as an individual, to see that individual, and her personality. So yeah, that to me was my kind of ethical switch, where I realized not only is it unnecessary, but I did see it as like cruel for myself to be participating in hunting when I didn't need to.
Yeah, I'm not. It's funny how I completely understand the vegan lifestyle. And I understand. I applaud you for it. I couldn't do it. Okay. Um, just based on who I am and what I do, I don't think a vegan lifestyle would benefit me from a health perspective. I know people who it works very well for. I know people who it does not work at all for. I do believe that a vegan lifestyle is very much tied to a Western world philosophy in terms of, and India is a third world, and India does have a lot of vegetarianism there, but they've also got a very different religious outlook on animals too.
Sure.
But I'm in Africa a lot. I'm from Africa, and you won't find a vegetarian.
Yeah.
You won't find a vegan. And I'm not. Again, I applaud your lifestyle. I think that if it works for you and it fits with your philosophy, amazing, right? Yeah. The only problem I have is, and this is not to you, is when people call me a bad person for the choices I've made.
Sure.
Right. And it almost gets to the societal thing, you're a bad person because you believe in Trump. And I'm like, I didn't have a choice, but yes, I do. And I love some of his work. I don't love all of his work. Sure. Right. Or you chose this camo over this camo. And so I think we're allowed to have differences in how we approach things, and philosophies are different. And you've mentioned the reason why you've chosen to be a vegan, and that's amazing. I've had a lot of conversations with vegans to say, look, I think I think hunting, and we can get into the conservation element of it, because I know that that's something you've done a lot of research into.
Yeah.
I think hunting as a lifestyle is as close to a vegan philosophy as you can get. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I do hear that a lot, yeah.
Because here's why. The reason why you're a vegan, and maybe let me ask, I think vegans are tied to animal welfare versus animal rights. Okay, you don't see that difference?
No,
you're an animal rightist?
I actually did hear some of your conversations with other vegans, and I was kind of confused by their definitions. I did want to say too, you mentioned there's no vegan or vegetarians in Africa. I actually know some and work with some. There's some I've met from South America, and there's also a group in Tanzania who is a vegan activist in Tanzania. So I would push back a little bit on that. But
I will apologize. I will apologize and said I shouldn't have said.
Oh yeah,
there are none. I shouldn't have said there are none, because that bites you in the ass every single time. Yeah. For the vast majority, there aren't. There certainly are vegans and vegetarians in Africa.
Yeah.
For the vast majority are not.
And I wanted to ask you too, I know there's a lot of different kind of, I would say, misconceptions about what veganism is. So I would ask you, what is your understanding of veganism?
Well, I'm not a vegan. So, but my understanding of veganism is that you do not want to impart any suffering on any animal.
Yeah. So
writ large.
So,
right?
So I think that's where a lot of the misconceptions about welfare come into it. A lot of people consider, veganism like a diet, but that would be a plant-based diet. Veganism, as far as the vegan society dating back to the 1950s when it was first created, is a philosophical stance and a social justice movement against the exploitation and use of animals as far as practicable and possible. So it's not really against the harm of animals, it's against the exploitation and use of animals. So I think there's a lot of cultural misconceptions about, veganism as far as is it about welfare, just improving the animals' conditions, or, is it just a diet? So yeah, I would just, like to clarify for your audience and yourself as well that true veganism is a philosophical stance against exploitation. So it is a little bit more broad than, most people, I think, lend it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, I don't think I'll ever be of the ilk that is not using animals, which is what you just described veganism is.
Yeah.
I think, like you've heard me say before, I think I'm when I talk about hunting, I think if it's those not the real philosophically hardcore vegans, ones that are just like, hey, I don't want to eat meat because I've seen the conditions that people, that animals are in from a meat eating perspective.
Yeah.
I think hunting is as close to that lifestyle as you can get if you decide to eat meat.
Sure. Yeah. And I have a lot of discussions online with hunters, and everybody wants to know if, it's more ethical to hunt than, to like pay for meat at the grocery store. And I would say, sure, that is closer, like you are taking responsibility for taking that life. But ethically, from a fundamental level, if you're still taking a life when you don't need to, like we do have modern evidence. The American Dietetics Association has come out and said repeatedly that a plant-based diet, exclusively plants, is applicable and, sustainable for all, humans. And it can also provide health benefits like a reduction in, heart disease, diabetes, certain cancers like colon cancer, which are correlated with red meat consumption. There's a lot of different reasons to, maybe adopt a plant-based diet. And I definitely like to get into, some of the conservationist perspectives of why a plant-based diet would be really beneficial for conservationists to consider.
So you said it would benefit all people.
Yeah.
Ben.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's true.
Okay. What do you think, the main issue with
because I've seen people become unhealthy.
Yeah.
On a vegetarian diet, on a plant-based diet.
Sure. But surely you would concede that, scientific evidence, when we review scientific literature, that's more important than like anecdotal evidence. I mean, I could also point towards like...
But there's plenty science to say the opposite. There's plenty science to say that meat-based diets are good for you.
No, I would definitely challenge you to find me some evidence for that.
I could send you links after links after links.
Yeah, please. I'd love to review some for sure.
Yeah. Look, unfortunately, today's world, science gets published left, right, and center.
Yeah.
Right? And people are publishing science, unfortunately, not in the objective lens that it used to be published in, but tied to the funding sources that typically are given the money.
Yeah.
And so it's not going to take a lot of work to scratch the surface and find somebody saying a vegan lifestyle is the be-all and end-all.
Yeah.
It's not going to take you a lot of scratching to find that a vegetarian diet is the be-all and end-all.
Right.
Or that a semi-meat eating diet is the be-all and end-all. Or the opposite end of the spectrum, a pure carnivore diet is the best thing possible.
Well, I would encourage your audience, and yourself to maybe look into some of the modern evidence. Like I mentioned, the American Dietetics Association is the largest group of dietitians and nutritionists in the world, and they've come to that conclusion that I mentioned earlier, that a plant-based diet is adequate and can even provide health benefits for the vast majority of people.
So you're telling me the Association of Dietitians and Nutritionists in America,
yeah,
which probably represents a monstrous group,
yeah, absolutely,
has come forward and said eating meat is bad?
Oh, no, they're just saying that a plant-based diet is adequate and can provide health benefits, like I mentioned.
So they're not saying that, they have not come out and said that a red meat diet does not provide the same benefits.
No. Like I mentioned, I'm trying to be very precise in my language, because they actually just republished this study, which is a meta-analysis of thousands of different, nutrition and epidemiology studies, to support this, that a plant-based diet can be adequate and provide health benefits, like I've said. But yeah, I mean, if you're interested in, the health impacts of, certain meat or dairy, there's definitely studies that we could look at on that as well. A lot of those I have on my website. We've got a pretty big list of over 300 different scientific studies that support the position that, plant-based diets are adequate and provide health benefits, as well as linking, consumption of red meat to things like colon cancer, increased risk of cancer, I believe like 15% increase compared to no red meat consumption. We also have, links to obesity and diabetes with meat consumption. But yeah, I mean, I'm not here to say that a certain diet is perfect. I'm just here to, educate maybe yourself or your audience that a plant-based diet can be adequate for people, which I think is really important when we start to correlate, diet to environmental impacts, specifically for things like that I think you and I and your audience care about, like biodiversity, and
Yeah. I I just want to be clear here. I'm not saying that what you do is bad. That's how I started. I said I'm all for it, right? It's just not for me.
Sure.
And I'm not saying that the benefits of a plant-based diet isn't good. It certainly is. People do well on it. People sustain themselves on it. And I don't think that there's people out there saying, and there's evidence to the other side to say the same thing that you're saying, but from the meat perspective. So the only difference here is philosophy, is a philosophy around how you value that animal.
Sure. Yeah, but
that's it.
Again, I would say, I definitely, if you have these studies, I would love to see them. Like, again, I do lots of debates online. I've never actually had somebody provide me with a scientific study that supports that, meat actually has health benefits, especially when compared to a diet that does not have meat. But again, like, I'm not here to discuss diet. I definitely
sure, and we're not in the health space either. So
yeah, exactly. Like, I'm not a professional. Like, I'm just really passionate about science. And I love researching things. But yeah, I mean, as far as conservation, I think one thing like I do like to talk about the plant-based diet for is in land use. So we can grow 14 times the amount of calories per acre when we just grow plants, compared to even the most efficient of animal products. So, for anyone who is still consuming animal products, maybe that, they buy at a grocery store, not necessarily as a hunter, but if you are contributing, towards animal agriculture is responsible for 80% of our agriculture land use, but makes up less than 20% of our calories globally, which is a huge issue because we do know, I'm sure you're aware, that the leading cause of biodiversity loss is expansion of agriculture, the main driver being animal agriculture. So that's something I talk to a lot of conservationists and hunters about, is like, hey, it's great, that you're interested in biodiversity and conservation, but we also need to look at our individual contributions and how that impacts the larger picture.
Yeah, again, I am not, and I won't even begin to start speaking about like regenerative agriculture, cows, and land mass, and what you can grow and how you can grow it. I know nothing about it,
sure.
right?
That's kind of the specialty. So
yeah, and so I am, though, firmly in the hunting space. I am firmly pro hunting. I am firmly, and here's where we will have differing of opinions, but that's okay. Because you've mentioned many times that you don't like, no, I don't want to put words in your mouth. You've mentioned exploitativeness or exploitation, exploiting animals.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons why you stopped hunting. And so obviously you've created a position that you've said hunting is not conservation, right? And exploitation is the opposite of conservation.
Right.
And so I guess maybe I'd like to get your opinion on what is the definition of conservation in your mind if exploitation is the opposite of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I always like to define terms, when I'm discussing with hunters, because I do get answers sometimes from some hunters that are really focused on like wildlife management, which is definitely a part of conservation. I agree. But my definition of conservation is more the protection and preservation of a broad, perspective on ecosystem health. So we're looking at water, soil, air, and wildlife as well. So when I think of the definition of conservation, that's what I'm looking at, is the broader picture of conservation, and that includes, like I said, land, soil, air, and animals in the ecosystem. So I don't consider myself a preservationist, but I do consider myself a non-interventionist conservationist, because I think a lot of the issues that I typically talk to hunters about, hunters will like to argue about overpopulation and hunting being a tool for that. I've found scientific evidence against that argument, but I think that a lot of hunters seem to overlook the broader conservation, and I've had debates with hunters where they'll make a claim like hunting is the main funder of conservation, which I'm sure you're aware is just not true. It might be the main funder of wildlife.
Who says it's the main conservation? Who says it's the main conservation?
Yeah, I've had debates with quite a few hunters online. And of course, these are random folks online. So take it, with a grain of salt, of course. But yeah, it's very concerning. And I've had other discussions even with people in my own life who also are under that impression, which I think comes down to the definition of conservation, right? And what you consider as conservation. But I think it's broadly accepted that conservation is a lot more encompassing than just wildlife management.
So that funder, let's just talk about the funding for a second.
Sure.
I would not say main funder.
Sure.
I would say hunting is a funder of conservation.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
To some degree. I would get into the details about what wildlife management actually means within conservation and what the goals of wildlife management are. Because I think often when I investigate, what hunting is funding, licenses, fees, the Pittman-Robertson Act, for example, and a few other taxes on hunting goods, they do account for less than 10% of overall conservation funding based on the studies I've seen in the U.S.
What? Less than 10%?
Yeah, absolutely. So even the USDA alone is about 6 times the funding, which obviously the USDA, as you know, is funded by taxpayers. So the USDA alone in 2023, I believe, was $6 billion. And the Pittman-Robertson Act was just around $1 billion. So even just the USDA funding for conservation through EQIP and other programs like that for soil and water are 6 times what that is. And then you start looking at NGOs.
But USDA doesn't fund any. I know you've talked about wildlife management, but USDA doesn't fund any wildlife management, period.
Right, but we're talking about conservation funding, right?
Yeah, but wildlife is a component of conservation, not the be all and end all, but it is a component.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. But you asked me about conservation funding in general, right? That includes land, soil, water.
Yeah, and when you target, I agree, it encompasses all those ecosystem services.
Yeah.
But often for all of those ecosystem services to proliferate on the landscape, you need to have a focus value or focus species. The focus value could be a species. It could be pollinators, right? You're going to get a pollinator garden. So that is the value. The pollinator is the value.
Right.
And there's multiple benefits that come from the pollinator.
Yeah.
You get soil health, you get water quality improvements, you get deer habitat, you get bird habitat, you get all those things because of the pollinator.
Right.
Same thing happens with wildlife management. You have a deer, a turkey, an alligator, a gopher tortoise. That's all funded through PR. That has all of these trickle-down effects. Pollinators, birds, soil health, water. All those ecosystem services come with the same thing.
Sure. Yeah, I agree.
So where did the 10% come from?
Yeah, so there's actually a few studies published. Again, I've got them linked on my website. Happy to share them with you. That do show that it's about 8 to 10% that does come directly from hunting or hunting-related funding. So Pittman-Robertson, et cetera, licensing fees through the state. So that's a culmination, and it also includes NGOs, so Ducks Unlimited, et cetera. When you compare those to non-hunting related NGOs and funding, through taxpayer funded, like I mentioned, the USDA, the over 90% is funded through taxpayers or non-hunting related non-governmental organizations.
Is the study that you're talking about, because are you talking about the Mountain Lion Foundation study with Mark Smith and Donald Wall?
There is one that does support a few others. I think there's 2 or 3 that were published within a few years that also supported that as well. But they are a little bit outdated now. But from my understanding, the trend is still towards more non-hunting related funding because, I'm sure since 1980, we've had a decline in the amount of registered hunters. Of course, that fluctuates. I totally understand that. But as we see less hunters, registering for hunting, paying for licensing and fees to go out and hunt, we're obviously going to have to adjust how our conservation, efforts are funded.
So, a couple of things. The Mark Smith Donald Wall piece is not a study.
Okay.
It's never been peer-reviewed. It's never been published. It's just on their Mountain Lion Foundation website and really an opinion piece. And I understand how they got the 94% because all they did was they say, well, at that time, 6% of the population were hunters. And that essentially is your tax burden at 6%. Everybody else's tax burden is 94%. I do think you make a really good point, though, in that hunters really are not seeing conservation from a habitat perspective. They're seeing it purely from the value that they are looking for, which is wildlife.
Yeah.
When split the way that you split it, habitat conservation work, that is it's really the vast majority, and I don't know what that percentage is. It could be 70, 80%, could be, is tied to federal government work, BLM, US Fish and Wildlife, USDA, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
There is a bunch of state-specific habitat management work that does happen through PR, through other things on the state level, budget work.
Right.
But at the federal level, the feds don't interact with wildlife at all.
Well, the BLM does.
Oh, sorry, I made a mistake again. I said at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
But BLM, they're not. So, for instance, elk in Colorado. There's no feds working on elk in Colorado. That's a state-led issue. Turkeys in Mississippi. It's not. USDA focusing on turkeys. It's rather the state focusing on turkeys. So, I think from a wildlife perspective, I think you can say hunting is conservation on both elements. It's just a matter of degree of how much they're contributing. And I would agree with you and say, if somebody says that hunting is funding everything,
yeah,
you're wrong.
Right, sure.
But does hunting have a slice of the pie? And maybe that slice of the pie is much smaller from a habitat perspective, but much larger from a wildlife perspective? The answer is yes.
Sure. Yeah, I can agree to that. I guess I would like to point out a distinction, though. Like, when I say hunting is not conservation, I'm speaking like from the first position of semantically, right? Because hunting is the exploitation of wildlife for your benefit, right? Like going out and killing wildlife for your benefit. So that would be my definition of hunting. And again, like conservation, from my perspective, is protecting and preserving, wildlife. So I would, see just even semantically, hunting is in contradiction to conservation. Now we can talk about, it funding indirectly, but I would like to propose the analogy of like a hospital that's funded by, selling cigarettes, right? Like if the hospital's selling cigarettes, to get more patients, and that's their main funding for supporting the hospital, I would say that's a little bit of a contradiction, right? So I think, it's a little frustrating to me to hear hunters try to argue that hunting is conservation. Now, I definitely get the argument of like it can fund wildlife management. But again, like what is that wildlife management for? The intention is for more hunting exploitation. So in my mind, that's more of like management for hunters to continue to exploit. So I find a lot of, friction with that idea of like hunting being a form of conservation, when in reality, hunting is in contradiction to conservation.
So let me pose something to you because I really want to hear your component to this.
Sure.
I get the whole analogy of the hospital and the smokers, but I would say that's very much tied analogy-wise to your philosophy of use of wildlife and making it sicker, right? I would say it's opposite in that, and I'm going to give you an example here soon, that hunting views wildlife as an economic asset.
Sure.
And from a conservation perspective, hunters, and there's bad apples writ large, across the world, that you've seen it happen in Argentina, that didn't value the wildlife as we all hoped they would, that they want more of wildlife on the landscape. They want to make sure that it's in balance, so you're not harming or exploiting other species. And we want to do that for perpetuity.
Yep.
To me, that's a definition of conservation, because you're protecting and preserving wildlife. And by putting value on the wildlife, whether it's an elephant, a lion, a buffalo, a white-tailed deer, a bear, you're protecting everything underneath it because of that keystone species analogy, right? That you focus, everybody benefits. And here's the example. I can take you to many different places in Africa in which areas are hunted and wildlife is increasing. But more importantly, and the wildlife is increasing so that the money needed to protect these areas occurs. Because of that action, because of the activity of somebody saying, I want to travel halfway around the world and kill a buffalo, regardless of the motivation, and the motivation's a completely different podcast. Right?
Yeah.
For a second, I want you to remove the motivation of that individual and see the consequence of his action. The consequence of his action is protecting 500,000 acres of land, sustaining multiple species, populations of species of animals, not to mention insects, birds, soil health, you name it, everything that you've discussed.
Yeah.
If a hunter wasn't in that area, because of value, the people in that area do not value the wildlife the way that hunters value that wildlife, unfortunately, but it's a reality. And they'll move in, exploit the wildlife, do a slash and burn kind of agriculture, create your field, open your field up, and then move on. And I can show you, again, example after example after example.
Yeah.
To me, that is like I would honestly say, the epitome of conservation in that regard from a hunting perspective. Even to the point where, for instance, there's a project in Mozambique that was a hunting block, severely degraded. They went in, buffalo herd was at like 2,000. It's actually one of the most amazing wetland ecosystems in the world, the Maromeo, that I've never seen, that I really want to see. It's 500,000 hectares of floodplain of the Zambezi Delta. Today, the buffalo herd's like at 28,000, all because of being protected through hunting. And then they realized that there were no predators in the ecosystem. The lions had been poached out and gone. So hunter dollars brought in lions. 24 lions got brought in. Today, there's 105 lions on the landscape. It's like 12%, 15% of all lions in Africa. To me, that's like how can you not say that that's conservation? It's an amazing source. So but hunters are exploiting wildlife.
Yeah, right.
But we need to be able to keep these areas and do the things that we do in these areas.
So I would disagree, because I have found studies that show that if we're focused on like biodiversity, which I think we can both agree that's an important part of conservation. We actually see studies that compare like national parks and protected areas having higher biodiversity rates over time than these areas that are hunted. We see this in places in Africa. We also see this in other places in the tropics. So I would go back to my analogy with the cigarette and say, if we don't need to be exploiting, right, and kind of causing the same issues we're trying to fix, right, that I would say hunting is potentially an exploitative issue that conservation needs to like regulate, right? And you're talking about the funding from, trophy hunting going back in and helping, conserve these areas. If we see equal or better, benefits from something like ecotourism, protection through NGOs, if we see equal or better benefit from these same systems that don't involve exploitative practices, I would say we should be erring towards those, especially given that we're currently in the, biggest biodiversity crisis that we've ever seen in modern history. And I think when we look at, the mammal biomass in the world, wild mammals account for only 4% of global biomass of mammals. The rest is humans and our farmed animals. So when I looked at that, that was one of those first things that was just like a big eye opener for me, is like, how can I justify exploiting 4% of the mammal biomass, when all of these other issues are connected to our exploitative practices, as humans, not necessarily just hunting, of course, but in agriculture, industry, etc. If we're trying to rely on these exploitative practices to fund the saving, we're not addressing the core issue, which is the exploitation, in my opinion.
So, number one, you're going to have to send me those studies that show that hunting in Africa changes biodiversity, because what I just described to you, I don't see how, from a management perspective, and management is needed, okay? This idea that, again, this is a question that maybe I'll just pose right back to you. Today's society has, our human population is pressing
Yeah,
on wildlife and habitat all over the world.
agreed.
And to me, the idea that we need to step back and take our hands away from it and go like, whoa, 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 we don't have to be involved, let Mother Nature do her thing. I don't think that there are places, there's very few places in the world that we can actually allow that to happen because of the press of humanity.
Sure.
And so management to me is needed to do exactly what you're looking for, which is how do we maximize ecosystem services, biodiversity, wildlife, everything, biodiversity writ large.
Yeah. Yeah, so I again would point towards these studies. One is called Effectiveness of Parks in Protecting Tropical Biodiversity. That's the one in the tropics. Then we have the African study comparing protected areas to trophy hunting areas. It's called Conservation Performance of African Protected Areas. And we also have Effectiveness of Parks in Protecting Biodiversity. All of these were done in the 21st century. So are fairly recent. And again, they promote this idea that there are alternatives. Like I would definitely not refute that, a hunting-based model can, promote biodiversity through the funding. But again, I would point towards the necessity of it, right? So if we have these other alternatives that don't rely on, viewing animals, sentient animals that can suffer, that have, relationships with their family, have emotions, etc. If we don't view them as resources, we can still protect them and promote biodiversity potentially even better. So I think that's really important. And when we also talk about like the overall goals, I would bring it back to the plant-based diet. If we can change our food systems, again, like the vast majority of our land usage is agriculture, and the vast majority of our agricultural land usage is animal agriculture. So if we want to protect and promote and rewild spaces, the best thing we could do is try to shift our food system towards a plant-based food system. All of a sudden, all of these rural areas that have been in animal agriculture and pasture, areas, the slash and burn, like you're talking about in the tropics, 80% of the deforestation in the tropics is related towards growing feed for animal agriculture. So if we look at that as our main issue in trying to rewild these areas and promote more efficient use of our land, I think that's a solution that everybody who cares about biodiversity and conservation could get behind. And we do have evidence for this. There's studies reviewing our relationship between our diet and biodiversity and the impacts on the environment, which do show that we could reduce our agricultural land if we shift to a fully plant-based food system by up to 75%. And again, like if the vast majority of our land uses is agriculture, and we can reduce our ag land by that much, like nearly 2/3 or three-quarters of our ag land could be rewilded or returned to nature, that would be huge for biodiversity. And I think that's what is most important to me in relaying to people is that there are choices that we make every day, regardless of whether we're hunters or not, that directly impact the environmental issues that we all care about for protecting wildlife.
Yeah, again, I'm not going to get into that sort of debate because I don't live in that space. I don't know anything about that space in terms of an animal agricultural land mass, in terms of how it moves back and forth.
Yeah.
I'd love to see those 3 studies if you'd send those to me.
Absolutely.
It blows my mind because I'd love to see those studies because there is double the amount of land in Africa protected through hunting than national parks. And so, and again, I'm thinking from a management perspective, how can a place be better managed than some of these places? And would a national park do better than a hunting operator? And the answer is no. They'll do the same thing. They would do the same thing. They would do the same management. They would even cull animals because they would need to.
Well, I think this is where I like to ask hunters, do you believe that natural predators and ecosystems do a better job of managing prey populations than hunters?
I think that in a system that is void of our fingerprints, the answer is yes. But because of the human pressure on those ecosystems, there are things that need to occur that humans have to engage themselves in.
Sure.
I think that there are predator populations that are gone from our ecosystems that we need to serve as that predator. Kruger National Park, for example, I'll use elephants as an example, and then we can move to the States. Kruger National Park is the premier national park in the world. Has almost 40,000 elephants in it today. It certainly has lost biodiversity in certain areas, not in all areas. But the reason why they're losing biodiversity in certain areas is because there's no predator for an elephant.
Yeah.
Back in the day, there used to be people living in these riparian zones that would push elephants out, that would hunt elephants, and elephants would be like, whoa, 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 this is a landscape of fear. I don't want to be here all the time. And so I'm going to sneak in, get my water, sneak out. And the riparian zones were in good shape. I think because of us humans, we have to, in certain places, and it's a gradation of heavy-handedness from a management perspective. In the backwoods of Tanzania, where your lion population is in a perfect place, how do you keep the lion population in a perfect place? How do you keep the buffalo population in a perfect place with this push of people around it?
Yeah.
The way that you do is you have to have funding. And here's the last thing I'll say about Africa, because it's unfair for me to talk about Africa and you're not in Africa, is you need funding to protect these areas. And for the vast majority, national parks are woefully funded from a finances perspective and need to be propped up. You know, Peace Parks is doing amazing work. Africa Parks is doing amazing work. The only reason they're doing amazing work is through philanthropic models.
Yeah.
It's not through a use model. It's not through an ecotourism model.
Yeah.
So I think, and then so in America, let's turn to America. I think America is even worse off from a predator perspective because of the push and the cutting of habitat and connectivity corridors and changes in prey movements and predator movements that we almost have to intervene to keep a balance of the ecosystem. We have to keep a balance of the values. Now, this is where we would totally differ, because there is no value of wildlife from a use perspective, from a vegan philosophy perspective.
Right. There would be inherent value as like sentient creatures, right? So like a rights-based approach from the vegan ethics perspective would grant sentient individuals inherent rights just on the fact that they are sentient. So that inherent right in and of itself, would be enough for us to grant it like protected status, so to speak.
But how do you pay for it then? How do you pay for it to stay on the landscape?
Yeah, I'd love to get into some alternative funding sources. So we have a few different studies that I found on alternative models. I mentioned a few earlier, like ecotourism. We also
ecotourism will not work everywhere, Ben. It in Africa. Like again, I'll go back to Africa because it's the perfect example. You ask 100 people, where would you like to go for ecotourism? Ask 100 Americans. They'll list 3 different places. And that's it. And they want to go in and out. And you talk about exploitativeness, water consumption, carbon footprints, waste generating. You're smiling, and I understand because you've heard it before.
Well, also the same issues would come with traveling for hunting, right? Like those are same issues regardless.
Not if it's 66 times the amount for one.
Fair enough.
One hunter versus 66 people to cover the same amount of money value. We're going on strictly tied to value.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I would point towards alternative funding models, though. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we're already seeing a shift in conservation funding coming from NGOs, non-governmental organizations, as well as taxpayers. So again, like with the decline in interest in hunting and exploitative practices of wildlife, we do need to reassess our conservation funding opportunities. So there's a few different studies. One, like you kind of shrugged off ecotourism, but I do have one called Assessing the Viability of Ecotourism as Alternative to
Oh no, I
Tourism.
don't. I don't shrug off ecotourism. I think it's a phenomenal tool.
Cool.
It's a great tool.
Yeah.
It's not like hunting. I don't claim hunting as the panacea or the silver bullet. Ecotourism is not the silver bullet. It's not the panacea either.
I would just say it's like an alternative to a hunting, focused model. And we also have...
I'd say in very specific places only.
Okay, that's fair enough, and I conceded. But I would point to another study which is a little bit more comprehensive, looking at government and NGO funding, as well as ecotourism and other methods. But it's called Alternative Funding Mechanisms for Conservation. So that one's a little bit more recent. But yeah, it does show that there is clear benefit in a switch from a focus on hunting as a funding mechanism towards more generally interesting for the general public. Things like birding, outdoors activities that don't involve.
But that's happening already, Ben. Why are they not paying for it right now?
Because,
for instance, the outdoor backpack tax. Why has that never gotten over the finish line?
Yeah, I agree. I think those sorts of things should be promoted more, especially as we see a decline in hunting interest. So, like, I am for things like that, and taxing, and encouraging, higher fees potentially on things like ecotourism and such. So I do think there are alternative funding mechanisms. And again, like the vast majority of funding already comes from taxpayers and non-governmental organizations. So I think we're going to continue to see that trend going forward.
Ben, what you've said it twice, and I don't know why I didn't pick up on it. You said there's a I don't want to put words in your mouth. Did you say a lack of hunting interest in funding conservation, or a decrease in hunting? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, a decreased interest in hunting. Like I mentioned earlier, the rate of hunters, like registered hunters in the United States, but we also see this in Canada and other countries as well.
Okay.
On the decrease for the last about 5 or 6 decades. So yeah, I think that in itself is a big red flag for our need for changing of our understanding of funding for conservation.
I will say you're right and you're wrong.
Okay.
You're right in that the percentage is definitely going down over time. We're at like 4.5% today.
Yeah.
The number of hunters remains fairly stable. Remains fairly stable for 15 years, essentially. So we're in the 11 to 14 million range.
Yeah.
And the reason the percentage goes down is because the American population continues to increase.
I definitely understand that. Yeah, that's just a ratio thing, right? But it still is over time. If hunting interest was to stay steady, you would see an increase with the increase in population. So that's why hunting interest, I would say, is going down. Maintaining while you increase the population is not, increasing or, So I do agree for sure. But yeah, I still think that is a big indicator that we need to reassess not only our relationship with nature and how we fund protection of nature, but funding for conservation in general.
Yeah, I break it down like this. I look at the world, and I think you'd also look at the world through this viewpoint. I look at the world through a land use viewpoint.
Absolutely.
And I go, okay, what are the land uses? And you've already mentioned this, so it's great. You've got a great viewpoint here. What land uses currently in the world, if you take it as 100%, which land uses in the world today are pro-habitat and pro-wildlife? And I say pro-habitat, pro-wildlife, meaning all of that trickle down that we've talked about, right?
Yep.
And I think the number is 8, 9%. I haven't done the math on it yet, but you start thinking about roads and railways and cities and, trailheads and impacts. It's not, I don't think I'm very far off of that number.
I think that's close. Yeah, for sure.
And so then I say, okay, well, what are the 8% of the things that are protecting habitat and wildlife? And we've already gone through them. You've got certain agricultural practices that are pro-wildlife, pro-habitat. Yep. You've got NGO philanthropic models that fund habitat, wildlife. Then you've got your national parks, your state parks, your communal lands, that kind of stuff. So that's 3. You got ecotourism, which is your 4th. You've got, I would say, wilderness areas. I would add in there places that like the jungles, the tigers of Russia, that kind of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
5. 6 is your carbon credit, biodiversity credit models for funding, and 7 is hunting. Can you think of another one? Because I can't.
No, I think that's pretty comprehensive for sure. Yeah.
So there's 7 tools. We have 7 tools to protect habitat and wildlife. And I have this argument a lot with people that hate us. I don't think you hate us.
Of course not. No.
But I have a lot of people that do.
Sure. And vice versa, right? Like vice versa, of course.
Oh, no, for sure. I'm like, why would you get rid of one of these tools?
Yeah.
We've got so little to protect, like this thing that we value so much. Why would you want to toss one out of the crib, essentially?
Yeah. I guess like what I would like add to that is that I think a focus on a dwindling, part of that, and from my perspective, again, like hunting being kind of dwindling, again, like the understanding of the biodiversity crisis and the kind of biomass of mammals being decreasing, and the species loss we're already seeing under, say the North American model of conservation, or just hunting-based conservation in general. If we were, seeing great outcomes from those models in protection of biodiversity and increasing of biodiversity in these areas, I would say maybe it is worth investing in that. But again, like public sentiment and the population of hunters as a ratio of general population, as you say, is in the decrease. So why should we focus on a small sect like hunting that is on the decline, when we could focus on something like animal agriculture, which is increasing? It's taking up more land every single day, and people are continuing to demand these products, which are directly causing issues that we all care about. So I think, in my opinion, the opportunity cost, like the biggest opportunity is in agriculture, and focusing on agriculture and how we can improve that and make better use of our land, and potentially even rewild and return a lot of this ag land, that has been misused and overexploited, into wild areas where we can have, protected wildlife and management of wildlife.
So you're actually for less animal agriculture areas, more wildlife areas, so I can hunt more.
Well, I think, I'm for more.
I'm joking, but it sounds good.
Yes, I am for more wildlife areas, no doubt. I mean, I love wildlife areas. I love wild spaces. Some of the best mental health, therapy for me is walking in the woods, going mushroom foraging, enjoying the bird sounds, watching the wildlife. Like, I think that is extremely important for mental health. And I think a lot of people who are, stuck in these cities, stuck on computer jobs, if they got out into nature more, I think that would be a net benefit for humanity. So if we can have more wild spaces, I'm all for it. And I think, again, the biggest opportunity is us focusing on agriculture land use by far.
Mm-hmm. No, look, and it's a great goal, man. And you've got a great ethos behind why you're promoting what you promote. And again, I applaud you. I think, again, I haven't gotten into the research of it. Certainly we can do better, always, from an animal agriculture system, and there's many examples of that, of people trying to become better, being more regenerative, being more, dare I say, organic. And I didn't realize that organic meant no till, actually.
So it depends.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it does depend. But I would like to point out, though, a lot of people think regenerative animal farming is the answer. Regenerative animal farming actually uses far more resources as far as land and water than factory farming, right? So it's kind of contradictory that a lot of people like to focus on like regeneratively raised meat or grass-fed meat, because the reality is that those animals require a lot more time to be raised, as well as land and water resources.
Have you looked up any of Alan Savory's work? Have you heard of Alan Savory?
Yeah, and there's actually a bunch of really good debunking articles and studies on what he's promoted. Unfortunately, a lot of his studies were very, very poor studies, unfortunately. But I actually got interested in regenerative agriculture because of his TED Talk. But the more I looked into the science that was backing what he was claiming, the less evidence I found for what he was saying, and the more evidence I found that true like regenerative agriculture is actually plant-based and trying to rewild, to save land and more efficiently use land. And again, like we can grow 14 times the amount of calories per acre, just growing plants. So that's very, very important. I think shifting towards, plant-based protein sources, such as legumes, would be huge.
But wouldn't you be fighting against wildlife in that scenario? How do you keep wildlife from eating the legumes constantly and losing money, essentially?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked, because this is a really important part of organic agriculture as well.
Talk about your farm. Give me your example. Like, what do you do to stop? Because you obviously have a lot of white-tailed deer around you. You must.
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the main things is companion planting. So not having a big monocrop of stuff that's just a big buffet, for these animals to come in and destroy. Even most monocropped in conventional agriculture, they account for some loss from herbivory. So, that's kind of baked into a lot of the agriculture already. But in veganic agriculture, there's various things we can do. One thing we make use of is wildlife corridors. So we make sure on the outsides of our property, away from where we're growing these sensitive plants that might be, grazed by deer and other herbivorous animals, we make sure to have a buffet for them on the other side of the property, right? So that they have habitat and carrying capacity kind of away from where we're trying to do our agriculture. There's also things like hedgerows, using honey locusts and other thorny plants to make an impenetrable barrier. Obviously, there's a lot more maintenance and labor involved with that. You can also do fencing. Of course, it varies in cost, but you can do really simple electric fencing, like with 3 or 4 different lines that will keep out just about any type of animal.
Yeah. That's what people use for, growing soybeans on their food plots, essentially. Yeah. You're doing the same thing. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But if we were to change everybody, I guess I'm struggling, because when you get into this big like industrial complex of changing this animal agriculture over to plant-based systems, it would be a lot of soybeans, a lot of corn. There would be monocrop systems that people are making money on.
Yeah.
I guess you'd have to somebody to do that at scale would just have to say, screw the money around the edges where you're getting wildlife conflict, reducing profits.
Yeah,
right.
And again, like we already grow, right, enough to feed currently 92 billion land animals. Again, like 80% of our farmland is devoted towards growing feed or, silage and stuff for these 92 billion animals that we slaughter to eat every single year, right? So when you compare that to 8 billion humans, we already grow enough calories as far as soy, corn, and all of the other crops we grow. We already grow enough calories to feed 10 billion people. But the vast majority of the crops we grow are fed to animals, right? Which provide us a fraction, of our calories globally. And there's huge, if you look into, the trophic system, that at each level further from plants you get, the more energy loss you have up the pyramid, right? So if you're consuming directly plants, you're getting energy from the sun into plants into your body. Whereas if you consume deer or cow or other herbivorous animals, you're going sunlight, plants, animal, right? So you're having
but it's not like an 80% energy loss between autotrophs and heterotrophs.
But again, like look at how many animals are raising to slaughter to, not even feed everybody in the world, right? Like most of the third world countries are growing grains that they then export to first world countries to feed the cows and, pigs and chickens that we all like to eat. So yeah, I think that's a huge issue that we as conservationists, need to look at, is our, like you said, land use.
Mm-hmm. Well, man, I love the fact that, here's what I love, the fact that the last hour and 5 minutes, I've probably said, yep, I agree with you. And you've probably said, yep, I agree with you multiple times, which is where we need to be. I think that a lot of people that listen to this will be like, that doesn't make sense. Or Robbie, you forgot to ask this question. Or Ben, you forgot to ask this question. Yeah, you're right on both ends. We both forgot to ask questions.
And I'm sure we could speak, on these topics for hours and hours, because we're both obviously so passionate about these topics. And yeah, I mean, I very much appreciate, the opportunity that you've had here. And there was clearly a lot of interest from your fans. A lot of people got upset by some of the coyote videos that I was posting about how we protect coyotes on our property, even though we have animals, that could be predated on them. But I am an advocate for, again, non-interventionist conservation, using things like wildlife corridors to try to make sure coyotes stay further away from the animals and the agriculture we're trying to protect. Same with herbivorous animals. So like there are these alternatives that I think are at least worth considering as we go forward in the Anthropocene, and the biggest biodiversity loss and species loss, like it's unprecedented. And I think having everything on the table and considering that rationally and having these hard conversations, even though we disagree on a lot of topics, I think there's a lot of, like you said, like a lot of really core things that we can agree on. And having these conversations is how we all grow and we, do better. So I think it's really important. And again, like, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
No, you're welcome. Look, I think what you just touched on is, I think it comes down to a gradation of lots of different things. There's a gradation on principles of use of animals. That's the first gradient, right? The second one is, I think, a tolerance gradient and a value gradient, right? So you just talked about, my tolerance, your tolerance, your tolerance for coyotes and white-tailed deer on your farm is a lot higher than somebody else's tolerance for those same species.
Sure.
And that tolerance spectrum is all tied to value.
Yeah.
And what you value. And you, from your philosophy and ethos, value certain things. Somebody else is like, no, I value profit.
Yeah.
And I value my dogs or my chickens more than the coyote.
I do too. But I understand that there are nonviolent ways to protect the animals that I care for, and I think that's what's really important is like recognizing alternatives. I think ethics is a really important part of conservation and of wildlife management. And I think that if more people had, care for these animals, even as hunters do, I admit, like, I understand that hunters really do care for these animals. But I think having an individual perspective, like recognizing the individuals in these ecosystems and their inherent value as sentient creatures and their role in the ecosystem, I think bringing those ethics into conservation, especially as public sentiment changes, I think is going to be really important going into the future for protecting and preserving biodiversity.
But Ben, how do you protect biodiversity on an individual level?
Yeah. Well, I think
because to me you have to focus on the population. To really make an effect. You can't, because there's 10,000 buffalo. How can I individually care about 10,000 buffalo individually?
Right. Well, I think there's a difference between, like only recognizing the species level value and recognizing like individual value and their cumulative value, as a herd or as an entire species. So like having that perspective and recognizing inherent value in all creatures, within an ecosystem. And we didn't even get into invasive species and alien species, which is another.
Yay! Let's keep that for another podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I hope you'll have me back, to follow up on
100%.
Maybe there's some other questions, your audience has or mine as well, that, we should touch on. But I think, a lot of these ethical considerations do need to be factored in. When we're talking about, protecting animals and protecting wildlife.
Sure, I can't wait to hear your viewpoint on invasive species.
I know.
Feral species. Jeez.
I recommend a really good book for everyone watching, The New Wild by Fred Pierce. It discusses this and it talks about, the ecological differences that are currently kind of being debated in ecology, and really since, the 1950s and 60s. On this idea of like a native purist perspective versus like a chaos theory, like alien species, the dynamics, of nature. And I find it fascinating because growing up in the timber industry, I was very aware of non-native species and invasive species and, the kind of demonization of a lot of these species. But as I studied like things like permaculture and agriculture, I realized that a lot of these species are finding a ecological niche or what they call it ecological fitting in these ecosystems, and they're actually increasing biodiversity. Right. So when
what? There's no what?
Yeah,
they're increasing biodiversity. Come on.
Think about it. Think about it. A new species come into an ecosystem. That's one more species. But obviously there's no.
If they do not get rid of or displace 4 or 5 other species.
There's nuances, as with everything in nature. But I find it a fascinating discussion, and it's something I'm trying to do more debates on, because it is a really hot button issue right now. And yeah, I definitely would look forward into, maybe an hour or two on that subject.
Heck yeah, let's do it. Well, you can count on it, because
awesome.
it is again, your philosophy around like biodiversity and exploitation reducing biodiversity, and invasive species and feral species themselves just having their own pressure on biodiversity just because they're there, and then the whole argument of sentience and non-use of wildlife if they're not in the right places. Shit.
Yeah,
I can't start now. We shouldn't start now.
No, I'm not a philosophy person really, but I love getting into the philosophical discussions, like threshold deontology and rights-based ethics and stuff. So it's something I'm new to. But yeah, that's a topic I think we could definitely even talk on for even more hours. All
right, we'll end it there. We don't want to get into it because we'll just keep talking. But look, man, thank you. Thank you. You're a top dude. I love the idea that you're pouring your heart and soul into 100 acres and doing what you can, and again, the rewilding, the corridors, the companion planting. Man, that's kudos to you, man. And I hope that you do start a cooperative, because people are going to be, they're clamoring for that kind of stuff.
For sure. And again, I want to thank you and your audience, for having me up here, and, for having these controversial discussions, because I think it's really important, especially in today's day and age. So yeah, it's really appreciate it.
You're welcome, dude.